Good afternoon and welcome to Chapter 5 in this series of lectures on the social and cultural changes in the 1970s in the UK, and where the background objective is to look at what does it mean to write history of a recent decade, and what would it mean to successfully have a grasp on cultural history. Now, one of the things that historians in general, but in particular cultural historians, like to try to do is to communicate the texture of everyday life at a particular point in the past. I think we can understand why this is attractive. People like to have the impression that they are closer to people in the past because they understand how they must have felt. However, it is also quite problematic, because how would you know when you had successfully transmitted the texture of everyday life? Some historical objectives, some historians' objectives are easier to test. For example, if you want to know why Britain had the first industrial revolution, you can have different opinions, but you have a series of objective, measurable causes of the fact that it's an island not too far from the sea, so the canals were so useful. The fact that actually, I'm not an expert on this question, but the political organization, the centralization of the political organization, the development of commercial, etc., etc. And you can have disagreements about this. How important was the Protestant spirit, as one famous scholar wrote, or how you can have disagreements, but you have something which is easier in any case to measure than transmitting the texture of everyday life. And so I just keep thinking about this. I'm not going to give you the answers, but this is only because I don't have them. We were in 1972, at the end of 1972, and I wanted to talk to you about a couple of publications published for the first time there. And this one, Watership Down, is a children's favorite about a tribe of rabbits presented as having language and culture. It will be later adapted into a cartoon film, and it was something new at the time. And many of the children's classics are much older. Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz and such like things are much, much older. At the end of the 19th century was very rich in these. Peter Pan, also the end of the 19th century. And then there was a later crop in the 21st century with Harry Potter and things like that. But Watership Down was one of these. Now, I don't have a huge amount to say about it, except that it poses the question of where does the history of culture fit into cultural history. We already have a history of literature where sometimes experts, scholars follow the history of literature and especially concentrate on finding what was to some extent, the context of the literary production, but especially the links between the different writers, who was influencing who, and who was inventing something new or not inventing something new, and so on. And the cultural production, the production of cultural elements such as novels or poems or songs or rock music, etc., always poses questions about what does it mean. And of course, it's not unusual for literary magazines to say this novel is the voice of a new generation. But again, this is something that's extremely difficult to prove. What is the voice of a generation? Bob Dylan famously mocked people who claimed that he was the voice of a generation. Also published then at the end of 1972, Blueprint for Survival from The Ecologist. This is this magazine I already mentioned, which was founded in 1970. And I'd already mentioned that some of their early productions were somewhat apocalyptic in tone, a blueprint for survival. And that, as I said, this was a tone that went out of fashion to some extent in the 80s and 90s, and came back, but more on the radical left with Extinction Rebellion. And you can see the Sunday Times saying, nightmarishly convincing. After reading it, nothing seems quite the same anymore. And yet the Sunday Times is a fairly, a fairly calm and collected sort of publication. I think it would be extremely interesting to read this today and see how how far they were right and how far they were wrong with the different ecological dangers which they suggested. A few years later, the Ecology Party will have stabilized as a small political organization, and a more sober tone will be taken. And their well-known publication from a few years later is Policies for a Sustainable Society, which makes you feel less panicky than A Blueprint for Survival, which suggests that, you know, we might not survive at all. Here's another publication which I find tremendously important and fascinating, because it's well known, it's almost a cliche that that women have made progress in the last 100 years, but you know, we're talking about the 1970s and the 60s and 70s and 80s. There was little by little more space in the public sphere for women to make their voices known and to have their work appreciated. But one of the difficulties they came up with was policies of companies, but also general public attitudes to the working mother. Policies from companies, because it was extremely difficult for women and often trade unions to pressurize employers into providing workplace creches, for example, which was a demand, for example, at the BBC for a long time and eventually happened. In universities was a demand for the staff for a long time and sometimes happened, and so on. So the policies of workplace, but also public attitudes, because if women went back to work after having a baby too soon, putting the inverted commas in there, then they could quite easily be badly looked at by the rest of their community. We had expressions in the 1970s, for example, people used to talk about latchkey kids. And a latchkey kid is a child who comes home from school with the key to the door on a string round their neck, because when they get home, their mother will not be there. And this at the time was considered to be a very, very much a negative thing. That if children were coming home from school, even when they were 10 or 11, you know, it was widely considered, I think, pretty unfairly on mothers. I'm sure that mothers should be there for, and, you know, unless they were absolutely obliged to be somewhere else. And people, you know, used to believe that in the professional circles, psychologists and so on used to think that, you know, oh well, if mothers are absent, this is very bad psychologically for the children, especially when they're, you know, the children are 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh yeah, maternal deprivation. Yes, this will cause a future of delinquents or criminals or psychologically unstable people. This is why this book was so important. Michael Rutter looked again at the theory among psychologists and the studies among sociologists of working mothers and how their children turned out, and pulled the idea to pieces, and showed that, in fact, although it was absolutely true that young children and even slightly older children needed adult presence and adult attention, it was absolutely untrue that they suffered if the adults who were looking after them were not their mother. So this was, from one point of view, a tremendous turning point in intellectual history, which both resulted from a more liberal attitude to the space given to women, and helped to accelerate this idea that it's fine for women to be working when their children are small. And this is part of a more general phenomenon that, you know, mothers are seem to be criticized whatever they do. If they have too many children, if they don't have children, or if they have children too old or children too young, they seem to be always criticized. So this is the whole idea of where does intellectual history fit in with the history of society and cultural history. Another tremendously important publication from 1972 is In the History of Art, Ways of Seeing, and this was both a book and a television series. The television series can still be found on YouTube today, and although its production values are somewhat dated, it still looks about the history of art and how it reflects society. So we're going to move up into 1973 and see what happens there. Well, our first element for 1973 is in fact in March, and it's the founding of Virago Press, which is a publishing press which publishes books, and is part of the women's movement, and underlines, as I've already mentioned, that the women's movement was a mass of uncoordinated, relatively disorganized, definitely not centralized initiatives, either protesting politically for political rights, or building culturally for safe spaces for women, or working on individuals and consciousness raising. So many things, and one of the elements was Virago Press, and there had long been a criticism of publishing houses by women's liberationists, saying, well, publishing houses are all run by men, which was essentially true. There might have been one or two women, and they choose what gets published, and they tend to keep women into, oh yeah, romantic novels. Yes, we know women do romantic novels. That's fine, and not allow women into all fields. And because of this, it was claimed that some fine women writers of the past are ignored, even if they were published, and some fine women writers of today are not given the chance which they deserve. And something Virago, the people who set up Virago Press, had an idea. Said, well, we're going to set up a publishing press which only publishes books by women. Not in the aim of saying nobody should ever read any books by men, but simply to do a little something to counterbalance. And it was extremely successful, and it still exists today, as far as I know. And indeed, if you go into the house of a women's liberation activist among the more intellectual classes, it's not unusual to see a whole bookshelf all the same color, because it's the Virago Press. And they published both fiction and non-fiction. So particularly a specific and creative response to women's oppression by building up a particular initiative. I think I had something else to say about that. It's been both classics and original works. No, that's fine. That's fine. In the same month, is this the same month? Oh, just a month. No, in the same month, there was a terrible disaster in a West Yorkshire coal mine, and 7 men were killed. And what was important about that was that it led to stricter safety regulations. And indeed, the 1970s, well, I'll talk about, I think I already mentioned the 1974 Safety at Work Act, which made the number of people dying at work really go down very, very quickly. Also in March, the Pink Floyd's 8th album, The Dark Side of the Moon. I know sometimes when I test this with my classes, I see that at least half of them can identify the album cover, which I think for an album which was brought out such a long time ago is really quite impressive. And March was also the moment when another little male bastion was opened up to women. The first women who were allowed to work in the London Stock Exchange. You know how they sell stocks by waving their arms about, and this was considered to be too stressful for women. And so they were first of all allowed to do this, which I think is very interesting, because the women's liberation movement understood that it was necessary to demand space for women everywhere, including in places where the activity was not particularly progressive. My personal opinion about the stock exchanges, this is a complete waste of money. But the point is to defend the principle that women have the right to be everywhere. And we saw this much later, both in Britain and the United States, when the demand was put forward for women to play combat roles in the army. And so this caused a little bit of a debate in radical circles, because some people said, well, going out and shooting people in poor countries, what's good about that? Why would we want women to do that? And this has sometimes caused a little political tension. Other equalities of this sort of caused a little political tension. For example, I remember that there was a moment when there was a debate in France about whether women should be allowed to work nights. And on the one hand, some people were saying, of course, women should be allowed to work night shifts because we want equality. And on the other hand, people were saying, well, no, what we want is almost nobody to work night shifts, only for real emergency purposes. And we don't want people to be working in factories at night because it destroys your health, which is certainly the case. 19, I don't know where we are here. We're jumping forward a little bit here, yeah, because I have to get through the year. This is October 1973, and the London Broadcasting Company opened Britain's first legal commercial independent local radio station. That was LBC, and a week later, Capital Radio was set up. And so this was very new in the sense that since 1922, the BBC had a monopoly on broadcasting. It was the only organization which was permitted to establish radio stations. And the Conservative government of 1972-74 was working on a principle that the more aspects of economic activity and cultural activity which are in the private sector, the better it is, because this was the Conservative ideology that the private sector is better. And so this set it up, and this meant that despite the fact that the BBC had really modernized itself from a young people's and musical point of view with the establishment of Radio 1 and 2 in 1967, this was not enough to allow it to maintain its monopoly. Although what is interesting to see is that the public sector continued to have an important, right up till today, continued to have an important segment of all this. Now, this year is a moment when the question of Scotland and Scottish nationalism came to the fore, in that the Royal Commission on Scottish Devolution, the Kilbrandon Commission, reported after 4 years' work on Scottish devolution. So devolution, don't be confused. Devolution means more local power. So it's not very specific. So it's certainly not independence or autonomy particularly, but it's more local power. And the Scottish National Party was already on the rise in the 50s and 60s. And the fact that oil had been discovered off Scotland, a lot of oil, billions of dollars worth of oil, gave a boost to ideas of Scottish autonomy, devolution, or even independence, because it was like, no, we've always thought that Scotland was poor, but in fact, Scotland is rich, yeah. And so the Royal Commission would give rise to a white paper proposing an autonomous parliament for Scotland. And this will give rise to a referendum in 1979, which will not give a parliament, and another referendum in 1997, which will give a parliament. And today there is an autonomous parliament in Scotland, and there was the referendum for independence, which was lost, but not very badly lost a few years ago. The poster you have in front of you is part of cultural, very much part of cultural history of the 70s. This is from 784. Now, 784 was a left-wing theatre company, and they got their name from the idea that they defended. They said 7% of the population owns 84% of the wealth, and it's not fair. And so they established the theatre company. It was a very interesting sort of theatre company, because it was not that frequent that they played in theatres. No, their idea was to go around the country and to play in trade union halls, church halls, community centres, sometimes outside in school playgrounds, because they had their analysis was that people don't go to the theatre, only the bourgeoisie go to the theatre. So if you want to do radical plays, there's no point in doing them in theatres. You have to take the plays out to the people. Now, this play was so produced around the country. It was also produced on television once, and you can find that on YouTube if you're interested. It's a history of Scotland from a Scottish nationalist point of view. And the Cheviot, the stag, and the black oil are the three tools which the English elite used to make the most of Scotland. The Cheviot sheep, because there was a moment in history when they cleared all the peasants off the land, not worrying about whether they had anything to eat or not, in order to cultivate pasture so there could be sheep. Wool was big money at the time. The stag, because at another moment they used large sections of Scotland for hunting. And finally, the black oil, which was discovered off Scotland, did not profit Scottish people as much as you might think, and certainly profited far more American oil companies and the British government, which Scottish nationalists tend to see as the English government. There you have the political poster. If you want it, demand it. Scotland's oil. Time to go for self-government. And notice the word self-government. It doesn't say independence, because at this time in the 70s, if you demanded independence, you might get 10 or 15% of the population behind you. But self-government, let's have an autonomous parliament making big decisions, but not all the decisions, like it's the case today, then it was possible to go further. And this is one of the reasons from the beginning of the Scottish National Party, which was founded, I think, in the late 20s or the early 30s, that they decided not to use the expression the Scottish Nationalist Party, because not everybody who was in favour of defending Scotland's interests felt that they were nationalists. So the Scottish National Party allowed them to go a little wider. 1973 was also a moment in the history of science for Britain, because Britain continued, even though politically the top country was no doubt the United States, as the British elite had found out to their cost in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. Nevertheless, Britain continued to have quite an impressive record when it came to hard science. And in this year, there were 2 Nobel Prizes, Nobel Prize in Physics. I'm afraid I can't remember what he invented or discovered, and Geoffrey Wilkinson a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Oh, I've got it written down here. The physicist, of course, I'm sure you all remember, Brian Josephson shared the Nobel Prize in Physics for his theoretical predictions of the properties of a supercurrent through a tunnel barrier. So now you know, whereas Geoffrey Wilkinson gained his Nobel Prize for pioneering work on the chemistry of the organometallic compounds. Which takes us into 1974, although I did want to mention 1 or 2 other events from 1973. The Vindolanda Tablets, which are the oldest surviving handwritten documents in Britain, dating from Roman times, were discovered. In Islington, in London, the very first Pizza Hut in Britain opened its doors. This was an important part of social and cultural history, in the sense that this was part of the rise in the power of chain restaurants, which can be sometimes very cheap. Of course, eventually this will include McDonald's, but can sometimes be a little more expensive, like Pizza Hut. And these days can be even more expensive. You can have restaurants which are not cheap, but which are nevertheless chain restaurants. And this went alongside a huge increase in the number of restaurant meals consumed by ordinary people. Before the 1970s, and even during the 1970s, it has to be said, many working class people went to restaurants for weddings, for funerals, and that was about it. And the rise of the Indian restaurant and the Italian restaurant, and then gradually the Thai restaurant, the Northern Indian restaurant and the Southern Indian restaurant, because people these days can tell the difference, made a big difference. So this is a rise in the commercialization of food, much less food prepared in the house, but also a rise in the variety of food that people were likely to eat. Yeah, that the generation, the older generation who are say 90 years old now, it's still not unusual to have people who say, oh no, I don't like Indian food or Chinese food, I don't like foreign food. Whereas people of my age, that would be extremely bizarre. It's normally Indian food is the most popular food in Britain, and so on. Another very important moment in 1973, which goes in parallel in some ways in what I said about the intellectual change in the idea of maternal deprivation, and that is that the American Psychiatric Association, who are, of course, in America, but are extremely influential around the world, took homosexuality off its list of mental illnesses. After 1973, the American Psychiatric Association no longer considered homosexuality as a mental illness. So going through to 1974, in 1974, 26% of men and 13% of women were heavy smokers. 51% of men and 41% of women smoked sometimes. The decline in numbers had already started by 2014. Instead of 51% of men, only 20% of men smoked, and instead of 41% of women, only 17% of women. Alcohol is a little bit more difficult to analyze because over the last 50 years, men drink a little less and women drink a little more. And at this moment, 2/3 of all secondary school children are educated in comprehensive schools. And this was also the moment when Britain entered its first post-war recession. And holidays became more important in the sense that New Year's Day was celebrated in 1974 as a public holiday for the first time. And over following decades, the number of people taking a whole week off at Christmas grew rapidly. No, that's not very important. That's not very important or interesting. In the elections, the Scottish National Party made a significant breakthrough, gaining almost 22% of the vote in Scotland. Whereas Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalist, got 2 MPs in Wales. In May 1974, we saw an important strike at the Imperial Typewriter company in Leicester. And the strike lasted 14 weeks, and it was a strike carried out by Asian workers, Indian, Pakistani workers, or people of that origin. And it was very noticeable because the trade union did not support it, fundamentally because they didn't care about Indian and Pakistani workers. And local branches of far-right organizations organized racist leaflets about the strike. And the strike was defeated. The company closed the factory, and the strikers lost their jobs. However, although the strike was a defeat, it was an important moment in the history of anti-racism and in the history of trade unions, in that there was an inquiry in the union afterwards about why the union did not support it, and the section of the union who wanted to be more involved in anti-racism and give stronger support to Indian and Pakistani and other non-white workers made significant progress. And this is in the context of in the context of the rise of the far right, because as unemployment rose, also rose the temptation of people to flock to organizations saying, I know whose fault it was. And in the 1930s, it was, in inverted commas, the fault of the Jews. And in the 1970s, they said it was the fault of the Asians. And today they say it's the fault of the Muslims. Here we have, in September of that year, you have a little cultural event in that you get the launching of Cfax. Now, Cfax was a service on your television, which you could control with a remote control, which would give you the news headlines or the weather and so on and so forth. That is to say that if you wanted the news headlines, you pressed 101 and it gave you 2 minutes later, it gave you 4 headlines, and you pressed the first one for what's happening in France, and you got the information. So you got the news which changed in real time. You were getting news which had been put into the system a few minutes earlier. Now, of course, this doesn't impress us very much today, because that's the whole idea of the internet. You get immediate news, immediate breaking news, and so on. But at the time, generally, you know, unless it was absolutely urgent, generally your news, you had to wait till the following morning newspapers, or at best wait for the news at 10 or the next news bulletin. The news bulletin was every few hours on the television or on the radio. And so this appeared to be very modern at the time, although if you were to use it today, it would seem extremely slow. So for publications. First of all, on the television, the last episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus was shown on BBC Two. Monty Python's Flying Circus being a television show which put forward sketches, some of which have remained famous. Certainly in British circles, the Dead Parrot sketch or the Cheese sketch or the Lion Tamer sketch have become classics and will often be quoted by British people without warning. Also first published in 1974, Voices of the Living and Dead by Linton Kwesi Johnson. I think I have him here somewhere. Yes, this is a Jamaican British dub poet who had been a member of the Black Panthers in the 1960s, and in the 1970s gained recognition for his writing and performance of mostly political poetry, which dealt with issues such as racism and police violence. And so it was one of the visible radical voices from Jamaica, whereas generally we didn't see them. And this allows me to, the other important, very important publication of the time is the Good Beer Guide, which perhaps represents the idea. It's interesting because, you know, people have this idea that as years went by, food and other products were more and more standardized, that everything was made by multinationals, and therefore that this was a process going on which reduced the quality of what people were consuming. And this may sometimes be the case, but it's also certainly been the case in food and drink that what ordinary people eat and drink outside the house is far better today than it was 60 years ago. Because you can go to an Indian restaurant or the Thai restaurant or whatever, and people do. And also beer has become much more sophisticated and there's much more types to be had. And I just want to finish 1974. Sorry, while we were talking about the Jamaican Brit dub poet, which was part of the history of racism and anti-racism, I came across these pictures of the England World Cup football squad, 1970 up at the top and 2014 at the bottom. And one of the things which comes immediately, which you see immediately, is that the squad at the top is almost completely white. I'll be able to move on to 1975 very shortly, but not in this video because I keep them to just half an hour, and so I'm going to stop there and go on to 1975 in not very long, but when I get onto my next video. Thank you for listening.